Okay, so you want to own a movie studio. Your name on the gate, movie stars on your lot, a cut of every ticket sold on Earth. Sounds like the best business in the world. It isn't. Here's the part that makes no sense until you're deep inside it. You can have the single biggest movie in the country this weekend and still lose $100 million on it. Not almost, actually lose it, on the film that beat everything else. Because the movie was never the thing you were really selling. The real money sits in a vault of old films you've half forgotten you own, quietly getting sold over and over for 30 years. And how a studio makes its money and how it dies comes down to one decision made in a dark room. They call it the green light. And most people who own a studio never learn which one they lit until it's far too late. Before you make a single dollar, you have to survive buying the thing. And the price of a movie studio has almost nothing to do with the buildings. You could build one from scratch, in a sense. Lease some sound stages, hire producers, raise a few $100 million for a slate of films, and cut deals to get them into theaters. People do this. They are called production companies, and most of them live and die on a handful of projects because they own the risk and almost none of the machine. Or you could buy an existing studio. And this is where it gets strange, because not all studios are the same studio, even when they use the same word. There is a huge gap in this business between what insiders call a major and everything below it. A major owns its own distribution, the network that physically gets films into theaters and onto screens around the world. It owns a deep library of finished films. It has relationships that mean a new project gets seen, marketed, and sold. Those trade for staggering sums, sometimes tens of billions of dollars, because the income they throw off is steady and it compounds. Then there is everything 2 or 3 tiers down. A studio that makes movies but rents everything else. It borrows someone else's distribution, it has a thin catalog, and every year it is only as healthy as its next release. Same industry, completely different animal. Now here is the part that breaks most people's mental picture. The sound stages, the backlot, the famous water tower, the real estate, all the stuff you could actually walk through on a tour, is often the least valuable thing you are buying. The land has worth, but it is not why anyone pays a fortune for a studio. The real asset is the vault. A studio's library, every film it has ever made and still controls, can be worth more than every building it owns combined. Those films never stop working. They get licensed to streamers, sold to television, bundled onto airplanes, rented, re-released, packaged, and repackaged for decades. A movie finished in 1975 is still quietly mailing checks in 2026, and it does not need a marketing campaign, a premiere, or a single new dollar spent on it. Read that again. The most valuable part of a movie studio is the part that is already finished. This is why some studios that made almost nothing new for years still printed money. The lights were half off, the new slate was thin, the offices were quiet, and the catalog kept earning, film after old film, because somebody decades ago paid to make them, and now the owner simply collects. A studio can coast on its dead for a very long time, which tells you what you are actually buying when you buy one. You are not buying a factory that makes movies. You are buying a library that rents them out forever, with a factory attached to the front of it. The factory is the exciting part. It is also the dangerous part, the part that burns cash and swings between triumph and disaster. The library is the boring part. The library is where the money actually lives, and the price tag tells you which one you are really getting. Pay a fortune, and you are buying a deep vault with predictable income and a factory bolted on. Pay a bargain, and you are usually buying the factory alone, a slate of films not yet released, a stack of expensive bets that have not landed yet. One is an asset. The other is a gamble wearing the same logo. Hold on to that word, bets. Because by the end of this, you will watch a studio that owned the entire culture get reduced to nothing but its vault, sold off for the films it made decades ago, while everything it tried to make new turned to dust. The factory is where studios die. The vault is what survives them. So the first thing nobody tells you when they picture owning a studio is simple. You are not buying the movies you are about to make. You are buying the ones somebody already made, and the machine that keeps selling them. But there is a catch waiting behind all of it, and it has nothing to do with the vault. It is about who actually controls this thing, and what the last owner already signed away before you ever walked in. You would think owning a studio means you own its decisions. You mostly own its promises. Start with who actually holds the thing. Almost nobody owns a major studio. the way you would own a business you built. The big studios sit inside enormous conglomerates, giant parent companies that own dozens of unrelated businesses at once. And the studio is just one division among many, fighting the theme parks and the cable networks and the streaming apps for the same pool of cash. The studio does not simply decide to spend $1 billion on films this year. It asks. And somewhere above it, someone weighing a studio against a cruise line or a sports network decides how much the movies get. So even before the traps, you are not a king. You are a department with a famous name. Now, the traps. Because when you buy a studio, you inherit every deal the last owner ever signed, and you do not get to tear them up. Start with the talent. The biggest stars and directors do not just take a salary. The most powerful of them sign what the industry calls first dollar gross. It means exactly what it sounds like. They take a cut of the money coming in off the very first dollar the film earns, before the studio has recovered a cent of what it spent to make or market the thing. Think about what that does. A film brings in money. The star's percentage comes out of the top immediately. The studio, the company that fronted the entire budget and took all the risk, stands at the back of the line for its own movie. On a big hit, a single star's back end can quietly outrun the studio's own profit on the film. The person who acted in it can walk away with more than the company that made it. And you, the new owner, inherited that contract. It was inked years ago. You cannot renegotiate it. You just pay it. That is one deal on one film. Now, multiply it. Because the studio you bought did not just promise money to talent, it promised movies to the world. Studios sign what are called output deals, agreements to deliver a certain number of films to distributors, to international partners, to television and streaming buyers, on a schedule. They lock in release dates years out. They announce a slate. Theaters build their calendars around it. Partners pay for the right to whatever comes next. And every one of those promises was made before a single frame of those films existed. Sit with that for a second. On the day you take over, your next several years are already spoken for. Dates you have to hit, films you have to deliver, money you have to spend to make them, whether the scripts are good or not, whether the timing is right or not, because backing out of a release commitment can cost more than making the movie. That is the trapdoor under the floor. The studio looks like it owns its future on the day you sign the papers. The logo is yours. The lot is yours. The vault is yours. But most of that future is already committed in ink you did not write. The last owner spent your calendar for you. Some of the green lights burning right now were switched on years ago by people who are gone, and you are still paying the electric bill. And here is the quiet danger in that. Every one of those forward commitments is a spending obligation you cannot easily stop. In a good year, they are just the cost of doing business. But the moment something goes wrong, those locked-in promises stop being a schedule and start being an anchor, dragging you towards spending you can no longer afford to make. You do not feel any of this on the day you buy. You feel it later, the first time a film you were legally obligated to release turns out to be a film nobody wants, which raises the question every new owner asks first, usually with a nervous smile. Forget the promises for a second. Forget the inherited deals. When this thing works, when it actually works, where does the money come from? The answer is stranger and bigger than a ticket. Here is where it gets interesting, because a movie makes money in far more layers than most people ever imagine. The ticket is just the first one, and it is not even the best one. Start with the box office, because that is the number everyone sees. A film opens, it grosses some headline figure, and the news reports it like the studio just pocketed all of it. It did not. Not even close. When you buy a ticket, roughly half of that money stays with the theater. The studio and the theater split the take, and early in a film's run, the studio's share is larger, sometimes much larger. Then it slides in the theater's favor week after week to keep the film on screen. By the time you average it out across a whole release in the United States, the studio walks away with somewhere around half of every box office dollar. The other half never belonged to it, so the headline number is a mirage. Cut it in half before you even start. But the theater is only the first window, and the windows are where the real machine lives. After a film leaves theaters, it does not stop earning. It steps down a ladder, and every rung is a new sale of the exact same film. First, digital rental and purchase at home. Then the streaming licenses, where a platform pays enormous sums for the right to carry it for a stretch. Then cable, then broadcast television. Then it loops back around and gets licensed again years later. It plays on airplanes. It sells overseas, territory by territory, on its own separate timeline. The same movie, sold and resold to buyer after buyer for years. One film. A dozen different revenue streams, opening one after another like doors down a hallway. Then there is the third layer, and it is the quietest and the richest, the library. Once a film is a few years old, it stops being a release and becomes catalog, and catalog is the closest thing this business has to passive income. Nobody markets it. Nobody premieres it. It just sits in the vault, getting licensed to whoever wants it forever. This is the part from earlier, the part you actually paid a fortune for. It is thousands of finished bets, all paid off long ago, still quietly collecting while you sleep. And then there is the fourth layer, the one most people never think about at all. Everything that is not the movie, the toys, the t-shirts, the lunchboxes and the video games and the Halloween costumes, the theme park rides built around characters the studio owns, the soundtrack, the licensing deals that put a face on a cereal box. For a certain kind of film, the movie is almost a commercial for the merchandise, and the merchandise never stops. A single strong franchise can earn more from products on a shelf than from tickets at a counter. The film is the seed. The stuff is the forest. Stack all four layers together and you start to see it. Theatrical, the windows, the library, the merchandising. Four different machines running on different timelines, all feeding off the same original film. The movie in theaters is just the ignition. The engine runs for 30 years. A film you greenlight today, if it hits, will still be earning money long after you have handed the studio to someone else, in ways nobody will fully track. That is the dream version of this business. You spend once, you sell forever, across four layers and a dozen windows, and the vault keeps filling while you do nothing at all. So far, a studio sounds like a machine that prints money from four directions at once. Steady, layered, compounding, almost impossible to lose with. Now here's the other side of the ledger, because every one of those four layers only pays out if the film gets there. And getting there costs a second fortune that never shows up in the box office number. A bill the studio pays before it knows whether a single person will show up. There is a reason a film can top every chart in the country and still, on the studio's own books, be a loss. To understand how that is even possible, you have to look at the money that gets spent before the movie ever reaches a screen. That machine has a second bill nobody photographs, not the cost of making the movie, the cost of convincing you the movie exists. The industry calls it P&A, prints and advertising, and the plain version is simpler. It is the marketing, the trailers you cannot escape, the billboards, the talk show couches, the ads bought in front of every other video you watch for a month. And for a big film, that marketing spend can equal the entire cost of making the movie. Sometimes more. Let that number sink in. A studio can spend $200 million making a film, then spend another $200 million telling the world about it. $400 million out the door. And here is the part that should make your stomach drop. Almost all of that marketing money is spent before opening weekend, before a single ticket is sold, before anyone knows if the thing works. You are betting the second fortune to protect the first, blind. Now put it together with the theater split from a minute ago, and you get the rule that governs this entire business. Because the studio only keeps about half of the box office, a film usually has to gross somewhere between 2 and 2.5 times what it costs to make, just to break even, not to profit, to reach zero. So a movie that costs $200 million to make does not need to gross $200 million. It needs to gross $400 million, $500 million at the box office before the studio sees daylight. Anything less, and the film that looked like a hit on the news was a loss in the accounting, which leads to the single most counterintuitive fact in this whole business. A hit is not the same thing as a profit. A film can open at number one. It can sell tickets in every country. It can be the movie everyone is talking about, the one that defined the summer, and still, on the studio's own books, lose money. Because the budget was too high, or the marketing ran hot, or the split ate the gross, or the star's first dollar cut skimmed the top before the studio recovered a dime. The scoreboard the public watches and the scoreboard that pays the owner are two different scoreboards. And then there is the trick that makes it even murkier. The industry has a practice, entirely legal, that outsiders call Hollywood accounting. Studios can pile a film's marketing costs, interest, overhead, and fees onto that single movie's ledger, until, on paper, A film that grossed a fortune officially made nothing. Famous blockbusters, films that sold hundreds of millions of dollars in tickets, have been declared money losers on the official books. Remember the stars from earlier who take their cut off the first dollar? They get paid no matter what. The people who instead signed for a share of the net profit, the money left after costs, discovered there was, on paper, no profit at all. The film made everyone money except the ledger. If the studio itself can make a giant hit disappear into red ink on purpose, imagine what an actual flop looks like. And there is one more cost, the one that never even reaches a screen. For every film you release, you paid to develop a dozen that died. Scripts bought and shelved. Directors paid to walk away. Money spent on movies that will never earn a cent, because you cannot find the one that works without funding 10 that do not. So the machine that prints money 4 ways also burns it in ways the box office number will never show you. The split takes half before you start. The marketing doubles the bet before anyone shows up. And the accounting can turn a triumph into a loss, which leaves the owner staring at the only question that actually matters. If the biggest hits do not guarantee a profit, and the marketing has to be spent blind, and half the gross is gone before you count, then what exactly protects you? What makes this business survivable at all? The answer studios landed on is uncomfortable, and it quietly reshaped every film you have seen for the last 20 years. The answer is uncomfortable, so most studios will never say it out loud. Nothing guarantees a profit, so they stopped trying to make good movies and started trying to make unmissable ones. Those are not the same goal. A good movie is a quality you hope for. An unmissable movie is an event you engineer, a film so big and so loud and so familiar that skipping it feels like missing out. Quality is a gamble. Scale, they decided, is a strategy. To understand why, you have to see the studio the way its owner does. Not as a list of films, but as a portfolio of bets. And the math of that portfolio looks almost exactly like a venture fund. In a venture fund, most investments do nothing. A few return your money, and one or two, out of dozens, pay for everything, and then some. A studio slate works the same way. In a given year, most of its films will lose money or scrape to break even. The profit for the entire company, the number that decides whether it was a good year or a catastrophe, comes down to a tiny handful of titles, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Out of a dozen or more releases, a studio's whole year can ride on 2 or 3 films. That is a terrifying amount of weight to put on so few bets, so studios did the logical thing. If 2 or 3 films have to carry everything, make those films as unmissable as humanly possible and pour everything into them. This is the tent pole. The word is exact. A tent pole is the single pole that holds up the whole tent, and in a studio's year, that is what these films are. One giant, hugely expensive movie built from the ground up to travel, to play in every country, to sell every toy, to launch a franchise. The kind of film with a budget in the hundreds of millions and a marketing campaign to match. The studio does not just release it, it leans the entire year against it. The release calendar, the marketing budget, the profit targets, all of it stacked on top of a few enormous films. And when it works, it is the most beautiful machine in business. One tentpole hits, and it does not just earn. It pays for every flop on the slate, fills the vault with a new franchise, and sets up sequels that will print money for a decade. But look closely at what they just built. They took a company that could have spread its risk across a dozen modest films, and they concentrated almost all of it onto 2 or 3. They made the tent taller and grander than anyone imagined, and they held the whole thing up with fewer poles than ever before. And every one of those tent poles began as a single green light. One person, in one room, saying yes to a bet the size of a small country's budget. That is the moment the whole year is decided, years before anyone in the audience buys a ticket. When your entire year depends on 2 films, a flop does not dent the year. It erases it. There is no cushion left. The modest films were never going to save you. That was the whole premise. They are the ones that lose or break even by design. The tentpoles are the plan. So if a tentpole misses, there is nothing underneath it. The thing that was supposed to carry everything takes everything down with it when it falls. This is why sequels and franchises quietly took over every theater you walk into. It is not laziness, and it is not that the people running studios ran out of ideas. It is risk management. When the one bet that matters absolutely cannot miss, you do not want to bet on something new. You want to bet on something people already love. A known title, a familiar character, a story the audience has already decided they trust. You are not selling them a movie anymore. You are selling them a memory and asking them to pay to feel it again. A brand new idea is a coin flip. A beloved franchise is a coin weighted in your favor. And when the entire company is riding on the outcome, you weigh every coin you can. So the modern studio is a machine of enormous, concentrated bets, each one dressed in a familiar face to lower the odds of disaster. But you cannot lower the odds to zero. And when one of those tent poles finally falls, it does not fall alone. It takes a piece of everything with it. It usually starts with a single quarterly announcement. A studio tells its investors that a film it has not even finished releasing is going to lose more than it cost to make. And just like that, a movie becomes a number stamped in red on the whole company's books. They call it a write-down. When a studio can see that a film is going to fail, it does not wait politely for the losses to trickle in. It admits the loss all at once, in one quarter, in one brutal line. A single film can force a studio to write down 100, even $200 million in one stroke. One movie, one quarter. A hole that big punched into the entire company's earnings because of one green light. But the write-down is only the first thing to break. It is the crack, not the collapse. Because a tentpole was never just a movie. Remember what got built on top of it. The sequels that were already in planning, quietly assuming this one would hit. The merchandising lines designed and ordered. The theme park concepts sketched around its characters. The talent who signed on for a trilogy. The release dates you promised partners years ago, back in that inherited pile of commitments. All of them assuming this film would be the thing that carried the calendar. When the tentpole falls, all of it falls with it. The sequels get canceled, taking their future profits off the table before they ever existed. The merchandising becomes landfill. The franchise that was supposed to feed the studio for a decade dies in a weekend. The stars quietly stop returning calls, and the hole you punched in the release calendar still has to be filled, on schedule, with something, because those output commitments do not care that your big bet just detonated. One flop does not subtract one film's worth of money. It subtracts a decade of plans. This is not theory. It is the oldest story in the business. Go back to 1963, when a Sphinx historical epic, Cleopatra, ran so wildly over budget that it nearly brought down 20th Century Fox, one of the largest studios on Earth, almost destroyed by one film. Or 1980, when a director's sprawling, obsessive Western called Heaven's Gate lost so much money that it effectively destroyed United Artists, a studio founded by the biggest names in film history. It was sold off in the wreckage. One movie ended a company that had lasted more than 60 years. Or come forward to 2012, when a lavish, effects-heavy tentpole called John Carter forced its studio to take a write-down of around $200 million in a single quarter, one of the largest losses in the history of a single film. The same year, other mega-budget swings, expensive adventures, and animated bets erased the profits of entire divisions and, in some cases, ended the studios or units that made them. And here is the human detail. Underneath every one of those numbers, somewhere, years before the disaster, a person sat in a room and said yes, greenlit the epic, approved the budget, believed in the swing. By the time the film opens and the loss lands, that decision is ancient history, but the bill is not. The executives who take the fall are often not even the ones who said yes. Careers end over a movie they inherited, a green light switched on by someone who is already gone. The person who lit the fuse is rarely the one standing there when it goes off. So here is the structural truth underneath this entire business, the one nobody prints on a movie poster. A studio does not die because it cannot make movies. It dies because it made one enormous bet and quietly built everything else on the assumption that the bet would land. The sequels, the merchandise, the calendar, the profit for the year, all of it resting on a single film. And when that film falls, it does not leave a gap. It pulls the floor out from under everything standing near it. One movie can take down a company that took 60 years to build. To see how that actually plays out, all the way to the end, you do not need a theory. You need a body. So follow One Real Studio, from the era it owned the culture to the day it was sold for parts. For a long stretch of the 20th century, One Studio's logo was the most powerful 3 seconds in entertainment. A lion, framed in gold, roaring before the picture began. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. In its golden age, MGM was not just a studio, it was the studio. It bragged that it had more stars than there are in heaven, And it was not really exaggerating. It made the films that defined what a movie could be, ran a factory of talent the entire world recognized, and sat at the absolute center of American culture. If you had told anyone in that era that MGM could ever be in danger, they would have laughed. It looked eternal. It was not eternal. It was a business. And the economics underneath it were about to turn. The slide did not come from one bad film. It came from the thing this whole story has been circling. MGM got bought and sold and bought again. Each new owner loaded more debt onto it, borrowing against the studio to pay for the studio, until the company was carrying a mountain of debt that had nothing to do with whether its movies were any good. In one era, an owner even stripped assets and sold off pieces to fund a casino empire, treating the studio less like a film company and more like a wallet to be emptied. And through all of it, the new films kept getting thinner. A studio drowning in debt cannot make bold bets, and a studio that cannot make bold bets stops producing the tent poles that might save it. The lion still roared. There was just less and less behind the roar. Then came the part that should sound familiar by now. In 2005, a group led by other giant companies bought MGM in a leveraged buyout worth around $5 billion, most of it borrowed. They loaded the debt onto the studio itself. And when the business could not throw off enough cash to service that debt, the math simply ran out. In 2010, MGM, the studio with more stars than heaven, filed for bankruptcy protection, buried under roughly $5 billion it could not pay. It had happened before, in slower motion, and it would keep happening. This was a company that had been bankrupted, restructured, and resold more times than almost any name in Hollywood. But here is the strange part, the part that makes this a finance story, and not just a sad one. Through every bankruptcy, through every owner, through every thin and disappointing slate, one thing never stopped being valuable: the vault. Decades earlier, MGM's classic film library had been sold off in pieces, so valuable on its own that buyers wanted the old movies more than the company that made them. And what remained, the films and the franchises MGM still controlled, including one of the most valuable characters in film history, James Bond, kept right on earning while the studio around it fell apart. The movies MGM was making now barely mattered. The movies MGM had already made were the entire prize. So when the final buyer came, it came for the vault. In 2021, Amazon, a technology and retail company that had never run a traditional studio, agreed to buy MGM for around $8.5 billion. It did not want the sound stages, it wanted the library. Thousands of finished films, tens of thousands of hours of television, and the green lights of the past, made by people long gone, to pour into a streaming service that needed something to show. Think about what that means. The company that finally owned MGM was a company that had never made a movie the old way in its life. It did not buy a studio. It bought a century of other people's bets. The lion did not change. It still roars before the films. The lot is still standing. But the economics underneath it had completely inverted. The future MGM could make was worth almost nothing. The past it had already made was worth $8.5 billion. That is the whole arc compressed. More stars than heaven to a line item on a tech company's balance sheet. The building never changed. The bet did. Which brings us back to the only question that actually matters. Knowing all of this, does owning a movie studio actually work? So, does owning a movie studio actually work as a business? The honest answer depends entirely on which studio, and the gap between the good outcome and the bad one is enormous. In the optimistic version, you own a real major, a deep library going back generations, throwing off licensing money every quarter without a single new dollar spent, a disciplined slate that does not bet the company on any one film, and one or two durable franchises, the kind with characters people already love, that print money across theaters, streaming, television, and a shelf full of merchandise for decades. In that version, the vault fills faster than the factory can burn, and the studio becomes exactly what it looks like from the outside: a machine that turns stories into a steady, compounding fortune. That is the version that built empires. It is real, and it is boring, and it is very, very rich. Then, there is the realistic bad year. You have two tentpoles carrying the slate, because that is the strategy, and one of them misses that. The write-down hits. A 9-figure hole punched into the whole company in a single quarter. The sequels you were counting on get canceled. The merchandising becomes landfill. The franchise dies in a weekend. The stars stop calling. And the release calendar you inherited still has to be filled, on schedule, with money you no longer have, because those commitments never cared about your bad luck. Meanwhile, the debt sits there, indifferent, and suddenly the only asset anyone will bid on is the vault. The difference between those 2 years, for the same studio, is the difference between the most glamorous business on earth and a slow-motion bankruptcy. And both of them run through the same green light, because that is what a green light really is. Not a moment of creative power, though it looks like one. It is a bet you cannot take back. The exact same decision that can build an empire is the one that can bury it, and you never fully know which one you made until years later, when the film finally reaches the world and the money either comes home or it does not. Neither outcome is exotic. Both happen constantly across the same industry, sometimes to the same studio only a decade apart. MGM lived the optimistic version first. More stars than heaven, the center of the culture, seemingly untouchable. Then it lived the other one, over and over, until the only thing left worth owning was the record of the bets that had already paid off. The lion never changed. The lot never changed. The economics underneath them did. And that is the thing to understand about a movie studio. From the outside, it looks like a place that makes movies, sound stages, red carpets, a famous gate. From the inside, it is something colder and stranger. It is a machine that makes bets, hundreds of millions of dollars at a time, in the dark, on whether a story will find an audience years from now. The vault is not the collection of films. It is the record of the bets that survived. The lot is not the business. The sound stages are not the business. The logo is not the business. The business is a century of green lights, most of them forgotten, a few of them immortal, quietly earning long after everyone who approved them has walked out the gate for the last time. You do not really own the movies. You own the bets, and the ones that outlive you are the only ones that ever mattered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, like the video and comment, where are you watching from? Subscribe for more.